For folks like us, the poverty or a general lack of well-being or suffering, pain, all of these things are not sort of individual or sort of isolated phenomena. They are part and parcel of and products of particular social order, which of course the contemporary social order is a capitalist social order. And so all of the pain, suffering, poverty, hunger, unemployment, war, injustice, so on and so forth are products of that social order, and the way that social order is organized economically, politically, culturally. So in this country, capitalism in Pakistan is of a very specific kind, which has to be traced back to the rule of the British in the subcontinent, kinds of technologies of rule that they set up, left behind, the kinds of structures of the social organization of production that they established and how it's evolved over time. All of these things would have to be thought about, studied, understood in depth if we're to really to come up with meaningful explanations for why most people in this country are poor. History suggests that where there have been meaningful efforts to try and address poverty or exploitation more generally, they take place. Well, they're political in the first instance, and they require the organization and consciousness of the very people who are poor, the very people who are at the receiving end of this particular exclusionary social order. So, for us, that's primarily what we do, is trying to organize what we call the poor, or people who work day in, day out to survive, and to organize them, whether in their workplaces, in their communities, in their educational institutions, wherever they may be, in whatever shape and form they can, are willing to be organized. Because without the organized power of the poor or of the working class, it's impossible to expect any kind of structural change. Transformation more generally, I mean, social change takes place regardless of whether folks like us do anything or not, because social change is a constant, ongoing process. But that change on its own, in terms of as a product of the established system, is very rarely the kind of change that benefits people. It's just more of the same. So if you want to do something different, if you want to really bring about the kind of change that, as you say, lifts people out of poverty or eliminates the structures that create poverty, that requires the self-organization of the poor. Forgive me, but I think this is total hogwash. Just so you know, it's not as if this is very recent either. I mean, this has been a constant, at least if you go back all the way to the beginning of this country, you'll find that pretty much from the outset, there's been a discourse around how politicians are just corrupt by nature, perhaps, and they're simply not capable of transcending their petty interests to focus on what is required for collective well-being. And that sort of discourse has actually served the purposes of the state apparatus, or what in this country is called the military establishment, because it's been this sort of assumption that politicians are just corrupt and simply incapable of doing what's necessary in the greater collective interests. That has facilitated numerous military takeovers, that has facilitated, sort of particular legal injunctions like the doctrine of necessity, which says, well, the country's about to go to the dogs, so if we don't get rid of these corrupt guys, everything will collapse. So, this whole discourse of corruption has to be viewed within that broader context. Now, having said that, this is not to suggest that the system that exists in this country is fair, just, or corruption is not part and parcel of it. But in fact, I think the thing to bear in mind is that corruption is very much sort of an everyday affair, and virtually everyone who's part of the system participates in what otherwise we call corruption, because the prevailing assumption is that to get things done, you need to grease some palms, you need to, and that includes for the poorest of the poor, because if you're stuck in a thana or a kacheri, you feel like you have to, pass on some money, or you have to go and find someone who's powerful and influential to help you navigate that system, and that's small-time corruption. There's big-time corruption. The whole system thrives on the fact that everybody feels they have to do it. So if that's the way we were understanding corruption, it would be much more meaningful, and we'd have a much better bet of addressing it as a widespread phenomenon. But the way it's presented and the way it's talked about is very shallow and actually politically quite dangerous. So it's definitely not anti-imperialist. Let's put that out there. Because, to be anti-imperialist does not entail an exclusively sort of cultural critique, which is more or less what, the religious right, including these Taliban folk, put out there. To be anti-imperialist is, as I suggested earlier, is to understand, how this whole social order, whether it be within a country or globally, is to understand it in holistic terms, and to look at all of its dimensions, and to call or to struggle for its transformation or for its abolition. Frankly, for me, the only person who can anti-imperialists are those who call for the establishment of a post-capitalist society. So that, by definition, for me, so they're not anti-imperialist. However, they are obviously they do benefit from and exploit, existing forms of injustice, and they do try and take up, or at least rhetorically, lay claim to taking up, people's real concerns. Here, of course, the point, what I think is a source of confusion, what you were hinting at, is that until quite recently, this whole brand of militants, whether you call them Taliban or whatever, were very openly patronized by the Pakistani state. It's not so open anymore. It's not really an option to patronize them openly anymore because of 9/11 and so on. But that's where the confusion comes from, because up till quite recently, a whole generation of people in this country were brought up being told that the Mujahideen are great, and it is our job as a country to support the struggle of Islam against infidels, and etc., etc., that whole discourse. That's still there in some way, shape or form. It still circulates within society because the state requires that for its own legitimacy. But having said that, they also have to condemn terrorism, and the confusion arises when, the folks who are terrorists and the folks who are the great Mujahideen happen to be the same. And from time to time, that's exactly what happens when the army has to take on these militants, and so there's a great deal of confusion. That confusion is deliberately sustained, as I said, because the state, even though things have ostensibly changed globally, still not quite ready and willing to give up its patronage of militancy. And more generally, it's favoring of this ideology of Islam in danger, and we have to be out there and save Islam from Hindu, Jewish conspiracy, so on and so forth. So but just again, to put it all in context, that's not to say that this sort of like scare, nowadays it's terrorism. In the Cold War it was communism, right? So you can come up with some ism or the other that represents an existential threat to the state or to freedom, or the rest of the world is freedom and democracy. In this country, it's Pakistan and Islam, and so on and so forth. So it really is a question of what you choose to be the bogeyman. Not that there might not be one. There has to be one, especially for totally unrepresentative states such as this one, which thrive on building up, some kind of scare phenomenon, so as to justify their actions and their denial of basic rights to their people. Not some. It's I would say a small but very influential section. The sort of relatively well-educated liberal elite, I think, is very, very keen, and has been for the best part of the last decade, to get rid of the mullahs, no matter what it takes. And this is an unfortunate and very shallow, short-sighted sort of point of view, because, as I said, it fails to recognize, or it basically ignores the fact that this long-term patronage by the state has actually allowed the right to develop, pockets, not small, not insignificant pockets of support within society. They, whether in the form of the prototypical madrasa student, which I think is a lot of is made of that, probably a bit too much. I think more generally, the ordinary sort of average, everyday Pakistani who, through the media and through education, are brought up to believe in this. We are an ideological state business, and we are constantly being attacked on all sides by the enemies of Islam. So this is real. This has happened. Most of this country's people have been born during or after the regime of Zia ul Haq. You can't wish that away. You can't bomb it into the Stone Ages. It's not going to go away if you conduct military operations here, there, and everywhere. So obviously, for obvious reasons, we can't support military operations. Not least of all because they're destructive. They actually further empower the military, which is, part of the problem rather than the solution. And they don't address, as I said, the long-term issues of socialization that have taken place. And so, I actually think in many cases you don't need a military operation to deal with these guys. You can. The military knows who most of these bigwigs are, or the state knows. So the problem arises when you continue to play this rather dangerous game of continuing to want to patronize the militants on the one hand, and then selectively root them out on the other. There's good Taliban, bad Taliban business, and that doesn't really work. Can't work, and it's not working. So it's a complicated situation. It's neither something that has emerged, as the right wing will suggest to you, only after 9/11. That's not true. It's been a long time coming. We've been screaming about it since when the Americans and the Mujahideen were the best of friends. We were the only ones who were saying it was wrong then. We're still saying it's wrong now. So it's not been something that's just emerged in the last 10 years, but it's gotten worse in the last 10 years because you have these very sort of short-termist solutions that continue to rely on the military and a military-based approach. And of course, there it's not just the military or the liberal elite. Of course, it's Uncle Sam sitting on the top of the tree. So it's complex, and that's why all this confusion is there. And media doesn't do particularly goes out of its way to keep that confusion very much intact. But needless to say, the short answer to the question is that there never can be a military solution to what are essentially political problems. Well, the Supreme Court has aspirations to be a separate center of power, for certain, and to an extent, you could argue that has happened, but only to an extent. I think, again, history is important to bear in mind. The Supreme Court has been part and parcel of the power equation since the very beginning. It was the Supreme Court or at the time, the Federal Court that agreed with the dissolution of the then Constituent Assembly in 1954, then facilitated Ayub Khan's martial law in 58, and so on and so forth. There's a long sort of sequence of events. Now, the only difference between then and now is that the Supreme Court now wants to operate even perhaps autonomously of the military or of the other state institutions. It wants to assert itself independently of them. In the past, it was sort of like the B team of the bureaucracies. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because there's, this particular, as you suggested, that the Musharraf, the anti-Musharraf movement coalesced around the person of the Chief Justice, and so he feels he has great popular legitimacy, and he can get away with pretty much saying, doing whatever he feels like it, because on the back of this constant vilification of politics and politicians. So he's the, in the past the savior was the chief of army staff. Now the savior is the Chief Justice. Although Imran Khan and Tahir al-Qadri would also lay claim to being to be out there to save the country. So there's always a long list of potential saviors, and it's just that in recent times the Chief Justice has emerged as sort of on the top of the list. I don't actually think they have any. I don't even think they have any pretensions to policy making influence. I mean, I think that it's more simply about saying that, we are an institution in our own right. We are also out here to save the ideology of Pakistan. It's not been talked about very much, but there was an episode when, in one of those hearings about the basic structure of the Constitution, when the Chief Justice very clearly said, if the Parliament went out and today made Pakistan into a secular state, do you think we would allow that to happen? So I think that's what, that they're again, playing that particular standard Pakistani nationalist card, building on, or taking advantage of this widespread disillusionment with political release, reinforcing it. I don't think, however, if you actually look at more recent events, especially the compromise with the second prime minister. The first prime minister they unceremoniously dumped. The second one they sort of backed down a little bit. So that suggests to me that it's probably a lot more hot air than actual substance. They just want to be viewed and valued as meaningful sort of brokers in the power game. I'm not sure that they can really aspire to much more than that, although we'll see, right? It's wait and see. And the other thing, again, just to point out, whether it's Chief Justice, Supreme Court, or the military in general, or this whole anti-politics brigade, Pakistan is a very divided country, and not necessarily along the extremists versus liberals line. It's divided ethnically, and that is often understated. So the Chief Justice doesn't have a great deal of backing or support outside of Punjab. That's the reality. And public discourse in this country in general caters to the Punjabi heartland. So I think that's important to bear in mind as well. It's not like people are out there, in the interior of Sindh, sort of like, harboring great hopes of the Chief Justice to save them from X, Y, or Z. I think that the politics outside of Punjab is of a very different tone and tenor, whether on this particular issue or others.